The FPC is FL Studio's pad controller. In fact, the name is an acronym for Fruity Pad Controller. Its use is basically to create a way for you to quickly access a set of samples and to be able to trigger them using pads. This can also be linked to hardware as well. There are many manufacturers who produce hardware units that come with touch-sensitive pads, much like the graphical representation we see in the FPC, and their use is virtually the same. Essentially, the FPC and its hardware equivalents are samplers. Like we discussed earlier, a sampler is simply a sound player. We can load sounds into a sampler and play them back using controls. The FPC is no different. It features two banks of 12 buttons, giving us a total of 24 actual pads to use. We can load samples into these buttons and then trigger these sounds by either pressing the corresponding pad on our hardware or by left-clicking the pad in the plugin on screen. The conventional way to use the FPC is to load drum hits into it and then use it more like a drum machine, but any sample can be loaded. To load a sample into a pad, we first need to left-click the pad that we want to load a sample to, and then left-click the folder open icon in the Properties panel. We can also drag and drop samples from the browser. Now the cool thing about the FPC is that we can layer samples on each pad, so we can drag and drop more samples onto the same pad to create more complex sounds. With producing electronic drums, layering is definitely the key to getting the right sound. For example, you may have some kick drum samples that sound okay on their own, but each leave something to be desired. One sample may be too clicky, another one may be too low, but layering both of them together creates a low kick sound with some top end punch. Once loaded, you can adjust the volume and panning of each layer using the controls here. You also have the ability to adjust the pitch of each note. We also have a master control for each pad. These controls affect the entire pad. Now, if you want to make changes to individual layers, use the layer controls. We also have mute and solo switches in the master controls section, as well as an option that says scale volume. Now, velocity, or volume, is the key feature to the FPC. When we're layering sounds, we can choose where on the velocity scale each sound begins and ends. This means that we can create more convincing drum sounds if we have the right samples. What I mean by this is you will need multi-sample drums in order to use this effectively. If you have some snare samples and you have a low volume, a medium volume, and a loud volume sample of the same snare drum, you can add them all to the same pad and then adjust the slider on each layer to tell FL Studio to play the lower volume samples only when we have lower volume notes drawn out, and have medium volume samples play when the volume is medium, and so on. This works because a drum hit will be slightly different each time you hit it and will deliver a higher timbre the harder you hit it. If we just used a single drum hit and adjusted the velocity on the piano roll, the volume would change, but it would sound mechanical and dead, because the listener could easily tell it's just a sampled drum hit and not a real drummer. But if we have multi-velocity samples of a drum, we can fool the listener by essentially playing like a real drummer. Within the slider area, the yellow line represents where that sample will be triggered regarding our velocity. If a note is played below or above the yellow line in terms of velocity, the sample will not play. But when a sample is triggered within that velocity range, the note will sound. Now, you can have samples overlap and have them all play at once. Another way to quickly use this tool is to choose Spread Even. This will automatically spread the velocity sliders out based on how many layers you have on that pad. I usually use this option unless I have a special purpose in mind. You can base your decisions on the graphical display above the velocity slider area. We can turn off the velocity feature by deselecting Scale Volume. And keep in mind, the changes that you make to this pad only affect this pad. When you click on another pad, the settings will be specific to that particular pad. You'll also notice that we have an envelope for each pad in the Properties window. This contains our traditional attack, decay, sustain, and release. This can be used to create some cool effects or to edit sounds to customize your samples. You can either use the knobs or left-click and drag the points to effect the changes. You'll also notice that you can create envelopes for volume as well as pan. We also have a reverse function which you can use on individual layers. To select a layer for editing, you can left-click on the little icon beside each sample. When it is lit up, that particular layer is selected and the changes you make will affect that layer. You can also use the up and down arrows to move layers up and down using the controls beside the Create and Delete button. The Create button will add a blank layer and Delete will delete the selected layer. Now, you also have the option of mapping each pad to a different key than the default by left-clicking the pad you want to select and then left-clicking on the MIDI note section. This will open a window that will give you a list of keys to map that pad to. This is great for creating custom mapping to your hardware if it has a non-traditional setup. We also have the Cut By option, which we discussed in a previous tutorial. Basically, this function allows us to have one sample cut off another, which is mainly used to create hi-hat open and close effects. Beside this, we have the option to route the selected pad to a mixer track. This is a fantastic way to separate all your pads onto their own mixer tracks for processing. I would highly suggest using this function as it will give you greater control over your mix. Now, you can still use the routing option in the channel settings window like you would with any other channel, but be careful. If you route the entire FPC channel to a mixer track and then try to route individual pads, the pads will start on the mixer track after where the FPC is routed. This means that if you put the FPC on mixer track 5 and then route the kick drum to mixer track 1, the kick drum won't actually show up until mixer track 6. FL Studio will view the kick drum as being on mixer track 1 after the FPC, and since we have the FPC on mixer track 5, the kick will show up on mixer track 6. I would just keep the mixer track for the FPC on the master track and then route each pad accordingly. Now, another great function of the FPC is its ability to use MIDI files. FL Studio includes a huge library of pre-made drum loops in many different genres and styles. To access these, you can left-click on the arrow to the right of the MIDI loop area. This will bring up a list of available genres to choose from and then individual loops that you can load. This is a fantastic way to save time and learn from various styles of different music. Also, if you're not great with drums and percussion, this is a way for you to insert professional sounding drums into your project without having to be an expert. Plus, because you're loading MIDI loops, you can go into those notes and edit whatever you would like. Now, since we're in the piano roll, I want to point out that when you load the FPC and you go into the piano roll, it is automatically set on letter mode. As previously discussed, we have two different size options for viewing the keyboard, as well as letter mode, which shows the names of the notes. In the case of the FPC, we actually see the name for each pad. This is great because it will save time as you can quickly and easily see exactly what notes represent which pads. Now, these names are determined by the name listed here. You can change the name of the pad by right-clicking the name and typing what you would like to rename the pad. FL Studio automatically loads the names of the pads the same way each time, and the drum sets you download from Sample Fusion, as well as the drum sets included with FL Studio, are already mapped accordingly. So be careful with changing names, as this can lead to confusion down the road. The last thing I want to look at is the menu. You can open the FPC menu by left-clicking here. In it, we have options to select our different pads, as well as rename and save and load pad presets. Now I want to clear something up. When you save a kit, you will need to save it as an FST file. To do that, you will need to use the Save Preset function in the Wrapper menu. This will save the entire kit as a preset and you will be able to load it back later. The other way to save data from the FPC is to save the pad presets. What this does is actually saves the data for each pad, but not in a kit format. This means that if you've created a killer snare out of many different layers, you can save the pad preset and recall it later. So in summary, if you've built an entire kit and want to save the whole thing, use the Save Presets As function in the Plugin Wrapper menu. But if you just want to save the pad as a preset to be called up individually later, use the Save Pad Preset option. You can also save the entire kit as pad presets. Again, this doesn't actually save the kit, it just saves the pads. If you wanted to use the same kit later, you would have to individually load the pads from the load menu on each pad, or you could scroll left or right through your pad presets using the left and right arrows under each pad. We also have an option to save all WAV files, which is useful if exporting a kit for others to use. You could export the WAV files to a folder and then create an FST file so that the other person receiving the kit will have the WAV files and the FST to load them. You can also export in SFZ format, which is used for various other audio programs. Finally, we have options for different note layouts based on hardware. You can also save and load note layouts here, as well as map notes for the entire bank, which you would use for your MIDI hardware in order to learn notes. And remember, the FPC is used just like any other generator in FL Studio. You draw out notes on the piano roll to create loops. The only difference is, instead of using the notes of a keyboard, you're working with up to 24 pads of samples you've loaded. I personally think that the FPC is a fantastic tool for drums and also has some unconventional uses regarding non-percussive samples. While it's beyond the scope of this video to discuss working with drums in FL Studio, it's important to note the velocity is the key to getting realistic results. No two drum hits will ever sound exactly the same, so try to get a hold of some drum hit samples that have been recorded at multiple velocities and then load them from lowest to highest and adjust the velocity sliders. This will allow you to work within the piano roll with velocity and achieve much more realistic and dynamic results. The FPC is the only tool that I use when creating drum patterns and parts because it offers so much control and flexibility. I would highly suggest spending some time learning and experimenting with this tool, as it will give your workflow a boost. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.